Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So far, there's been multiple reports of Russian advances, but it is by a source that is fairly reliable, but it doesn't have the history that Cyriac Maps has, so I'm waiting until he comes with his reports about these advancements. But so far, it is reported that the Russians have managed to make an advancement here in the northern parts of the forest area, and that fighting is taking place here in the northern parts of the residential area. And this is a lot more that we need to talk about in this section. But we move further north, where in the direction of Avdiivka, it is also reported that the Russians managed to recapture the fortifications here that the Ukrainians captured at the end of last month, as well as some advancements in the direction of Yampolivka here in the forest areas, where the Russians had some recent advancements in the end of last month. So there's been many reports of Russian advancements over the past 24 hours, yet no reports of Ukrainian advancements, which shows that in the end it is pretty much back and forth on both sides, despite the Ukrainians having their own sole advancements yesterday and the Russians having their own sole advancements today. In the end, it turns out that some reports are simply delayed and others come in bulks. This is why we see that although a lot was reported yesterday, likely much of it didn't take place yesterday, but the day before or a week before. But what we see right now from the Russian side is pretty much all at most recent times, as a lot of the reports are taking place as they happen. Likely the Ukrainian efforts here by the military base, which shows them regaining a foothold within the base, is from the weeks of fighting that took place, about 2 weeks of fighting that took place about the military base after the Russians quickly captured it. The Ukrainians quickly realized this was a small group of forces, so they moved into counterattack and they managed to regain a foothold, and fighting continues in that section as of today. So we see that there's constant fighting all throughout the front line, but sometimes the territory advancements are reported late. Now, moving back to reported advancements in fighting, here in the east of Avdiivka, if the Russians manage to gain a foothold within the forest area to the north, then it is likely an attempt by the Russians to attack from two sides and meet in the middle. Instead of going through in one direction, they can simply attack at multiple areas, since this forest area is fairly long but not really that wide in areas. So if the Russians enter in multiple areas, then they can get rid of it quickly and overcome it quickly, instead of spending a lot of time going through it one by one. So it is likely that the Russians will continue making and getting further footholds to gain full control over the forest area. As for the north of it, taking a look at the area here to the west of Kamyanka, since the Russians now have a foothold within the city of Avdiivka, this whole area in the center will quickly fall into the Russian hands. The main reason for this is that there's no secure supply lines for the Ukrainians. So if they stayed behind in the area, they would end up getting surrounded at some point, and they would take a lot of casualties for no gain or no positives, no benefits. So the Ukrainians likely have already retreated, and this would mean that the Russians will quickly come in and take control over the area. Having this whole area secured on their side would mean that they can concentrate all of their forces into Avdiivka and storm it from the north. The Ukrainians have no significant fortifications in the area. The Russians have the waste heap to overlook the area, so the Russians would simply have a somewhat easy way into Avdiivka. And this is actually very dangerous for Ukraine. The main reason for that is this dacha area to the north is not really secure for them, but the most secure area they have is the Avdiivsky coke plant. But if the Russians attack from the east, they can simply ignore it and go straight for the roads if they go through the city itself. And the city itself is not really that wide. It is not wide, it is long. The height of the city compared to the width of the city is significantly different. So based on this, we can see that the Russians could simply launch an attack from the east to the west of the city, storming it and cutting off the main supply route in and out of Avdiivka. This would mean that the Russians would be able to capture all of Avdiivka except for the coke plant by simply cutting off the supply route. We can see that the distance between the Russian foothold and the end of the city is 1.6 kilometers. And it is reported that the Russians are simply fighting through it, trying to capture it, moving in a western direction. so they'll likely move and expand their zone of control before moving in a western direction, getting the eastern flank or the northern flank of the railways that go through the center of the city, and then move on to capture the residential area south of the coke plant, and then they would capture the residential area right by the roads. And if they manage to capture that, they will have the train station to the south, and they will have the dash area and the coke plant to the north, and then they would have completely cut off the supply route in and out of Avdiivka. There is this road here to the south, but with the Russian positions in the forest lines south of that, they'll have direct fire on the road, which means that Avdiivka would be in an operational encirclement, and the only road in and out is this dirt road. So if the rain starts falling, they will have no proper supply route. It will become the road of death, similar to the road of death of Bakhmut, which was the 00506 road between Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. So with this, we see that the Ukrainians are in a very, very bad situation with this breakthrough the Russians had in the north of Avdiivka, which ends up being a huge threat to the only supply route in and out of Avdiivka. At this rate, it is very difficult to see at exactly what stage the Russians are in, because what strategy they choose depends a lot on what forces they have available and how much equipment, etc., and how much the Ukrainians have. But in the end, if the Ukrainians end up in a situation where the Russians are storming towards the sole supply route in and out of Avdiivka, they may want to redirect their forces to fight against this. So they will take their forces from elsewhere in the areas to attack those positions, which would weaken other positions, and the Russians could speed up and quicken their own attacks over the Ukrainian positions and take control over other areas. For example, the forest areas and the dacha areas to the northeast and southeast of Avdiivka would be the first one to lose their defenders, because if they are cut off, then they are lost. So they may as well pull them back to safer areas where they can protect the supply routes, which is much more important than the forest areas to the very east of Avdiivka outside of the city. So in the end, all of these developments spell one thing, and that's for sure, and that is that the Russian foothold within Avdiivka to the north is extremely dangerous for the Ukrainian defense of the city, and is an heavy opportunity for the Russians to simply end this battle much quicker than anticipated by cutting off the supply routes and repeating the Battle of Bakhmut by simply cutting off all of the supplies going in and out of the city. So with this, we see that there is a significant development, and we have to keep an eye on what happens here in the north of Avdiivka to be sure of whether or not the Russians will face major success, or if the Ukrainians will be able to defend their exposed flank. Moving north in the direction of Avdiivka, with this report, it simply shows that the Ukrainians likely took an area that was hardly well defended, or that they themselves left it without hardly defending it, while the Russians simply took advantage of that. What exactly happens, we don't know, but what we do know is that it changed hands without any footage of the fighting, so we can't really say much about it, except that the Ukrainians took it, the Russians likely recaptured it, so there's not really much to consider about this section of the front. Further north in the direction of Yampolivka, if the reports are true and the Russians have managed to capture pretty much this parts right here, getting a foothold in the forest patch east of Yampolivka and capturing the heavily fortified area here to the southeast, we will likely see that the Russians will continue advancing through the forest areas. There's going to be a lot of tree fighting between the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers, and we'll have to see if the Russians will simply keep going until to reach the village, or if they'll continue focusing on a northern direction, or if they'll combine an attack on Yampolivka with an attack on Terny through the forest areas here, or if they'll continue capturing the forest areas and then launch armored assaults in the fields next to these forest areas. What happens, there's a lot of speculation on it because they haven't made any moves yet, but what it seems like so far is that they'll continue fighting over the forest areas and fortifications to try and get closer and closer to the villages before trying to take control over everything east of the Serbets River that goes through the east of Liman. Capturing the Serbets River will allow the Russians to start staging an offensive in the direction of Liman. What we can say about the winter so far for the Russians is that most of it has been some positional fighting and just small advancements that has allowed them to get closer and closer to a position where they can start staging a larger offensive. The Russians likely have no plans of a larger offensive yet. Likely it will happen at the end of 2024 or start of 2025, when they have finished building up their army to the level that they have planned since the start of the war. And with that, we'll likely see that the Russians will increase their efforts throughout the front, or even start a new front to start launching attacks and collapsing the Ukrainian army, which is not growing at the rate at which the Russians are currently growing, and the Russians will eventually overpower them purely by the speed of their recruitment and the supply of their necessary equipment to their army. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.